week-long assembly of bishops that revealed deep divisions in the church on how to respond to homosexuality and divorce.
High-heeled shoes and cosmetics into the trash can.
Will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
Backwards 17 times as events have heightened or lessened the possibility of a nuclear war.
There is a tomorrow. It's not all going to be over with a big flash and a bomb. That the human race is improving. That we have things to be proud of. In those days, when you couldn't get even blacks on television, that I not only had a black, but a black woman and a black officer. We treated such things as mixed races aboard the spaceship, and whether women could be in charge of anything and so on. And when we shocked the audience by saying yes to those questions, great affection I have for Asians and what they do and the important part they play in the world. And I just could not have a group of Earth people without including that. It's not all over. It's not all. We're not going to go up in smoke. We're going to make it. Because it says the human adventure has just begun. That's it in a nutshell.
Live long and prosper. Image of Serac, father of all we now hold true.
All your people must learn before you can reach for the stars.
First time any man's freedom is trodden on, we're all damaged.
On Earth, there is no poverty, no crime, no war.
One voice can be stronger than 1,000 voices.
Never spend more for an acquisition than you have to.
So much the better. All that mattered was Cardassia. I loved my homeland. That's what justified my actions.
What I have done was for the Empire.
Nobody leaves paradise. Everyone should want to be in the Federation. Hell, you even want the Cardassians to join.
It's the Klingons. They're nothing compared to what's waiting.
I am a Jem'Hadar. It is the order of things.
I obey the Founders in all things.
The Salads have always been a threat to us. That's the only justification we need.
There is no me. There is only us. One mind.
Star Trek is the most successful and longest-running American science fiction franchise in history. It is set in a future Earth, where humanism and advanced technology has solved all of the planet's humanitarian problems, abolishing crime, disease, poverty, and hunger. After discovering that humanity was not alone in the galaxy, the United Earth government creates the defensive agency of Starfleet to continuously explore the galaxy and gain a better understanding of the universe around them. Most of the stories in Star Trek are based on the challenges Starfleet faced while exploring and the many conflicts they have with outside alien cultures. Star Trek was created by Gene Roddenberry in the 1960s, a time where America was going through a counterculture revolution of social norms. Traditional values of church and conservatism were being challenged by alternative social groups. Social issues such as human sexuality, women's rights, racial rights, traditional modes of authority, psychoactive drug use, and the interpretation of the American dream were all being challenged. Civil disobedience campaigns were encouraged through cultural revolutions, which would sometimes devolve into riots across American societies. Many conservative Americans were against these activists and opposed the social norms they were advocating. They considered this counterculture revolution to be a degenerate decay of American values, promoting irresponsible excess, sexual promiscuity, flamboyancy, and a breakdown of social order. The peak of these conflicts involved the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy as they pushed for revolutionary social and civil reforms. In addition to the countercultural revolution, the Western world was engulfed in the Cold War. Proxy wars were fought all across Europe and Asia, between the Eastern Bloc and Capitalist Bloc, dividing Americans over its ethical involvement in foreign policies. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed that the US government had been subverted by Soviet espionage, starting America's Second Red Scare campaign, fueling hysterical witch hunts for communist sympathizers. The Vietnam War particularly sparked many debates and conflicts, which only further divided American society. And all this was happening under the looming threat of nuclear annihilation, which overshadowed the world entirely. Many thought these dark days were precluding to the end of times. Some were convinced that the human race would not survive to see the 1980s. This was reflected with the symbolic doomsday clock and the popularity of 1960s post-apocalyptic films such as The Time Machine, Planet of the Apes, and Doctor Strangelove. Gene Roddenberry, living amidst the belief that the world would face certain doom, envisioned a brighter future for humanity. A future where not only humanity had survived the Cold War, but that they would be exploring the stars together in unity. This vision was expressed through his original television series Star Trek. It featured television's first multiracial cast, and was one of the first shows to make a firm progressive stance on civil rights. He used his artistic and writing capabilities to demonstrate the values of humanism and futurism through the crew of the Enterprise, while also expressing various political and social commentary to a divided audience. He foresaw a future where humanity would outgrow racial, sexual, and gender divides, and that people instead would be judged on their character, their capabilities, and their virtues, which was a standard that was not accepted at the time. Being a self-described atheist and humanist, Roddenberry anticipated that religion and other dogmatic beliefs would no longer be valued in future societies. He believed that most humanitarian problems of the future would be solved through critical thinking and human agency, and that people would preference science and secularism over mysticism to help shape and understand the world around them. Roddenberry also predicted that future technological advancements would solve various humanitarian issues of the world. These technological predictions included cell phones, automatic doors, flat-screen displays, replicators, universal translators, handheld computers, and holodecks, which mostly all came true. He envisioned that these technologies would usher in a new post-scarcity economy, where money and greed are no longer seen as a driving force of human development. Many technological advancements has been influenced by Star Trek fiction in the science industry and the medical industry. There's been multiple spin-offs of the original series, including movies, additional TV shows, games, comics, novels, and Star Trek-themed attractions. And the current value of the Star Trek franchise is estimated to be worth in the billions. Because of the popularity of Star Trek and its unique depiction of a new world economy, Star Trek is often referenced as the inevitable true economic future of society, where people have outgrown the need for capitalism, greed, and money, and instead will be motivated to improve themselves and others through compassion, selflessness, and altruism ideals. Despite the utopian setting of Star Trek, humanity faces significant dangers and threats from outside alien species. The most recognized threats include the Borg and the Klingons, as their aggressive cultures clashes with ours and endangers humanity's future in the Star Trek universe. What events did Earth go through to create the Federation? How accurate is the post-scarcity economy of the Star Trek series? And what can we learn from the many alien cultures of the Star Trek universe? This is Love, Life and Anarchy, and I'll be answering these questions as we explore the philosophy of Star Trek.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Although the original series of Star Trek was set 3 centuries after the events of the countercultural revolution of the 60s and the Cold War, it was these events that ultimately led to the creation of Star Trek's United Federation of Planets in the future. After the many conflicts of the 1960s, which included the aftermath of World War II, the failures of democracy, the totalitarian nature of Soviet republics, the disunification of the American people through the countercultural revolution, and the constant threat of nuclear destruction throughout the Cold War, many people believed that humanity were not inherently capable of managing their own affairs. Scientists, philosophers, and teachers were convinced that the human race was too weak and underdeveloped to run itself, and that a better world wasn't possible without better people living in it. They argued that democracy, socialism, religion, communism, and other ideologies that promoted utopian ideals will always lead to disasters because of the limitations inherent within human nature. For these reasons, it was concluded that the only way to overcome the disorders of the world was to improve the capabilities of the human species itself. This is what motivated a small group of scientists to start a secret scientific project called the Chrysalis Project, designed to forcefully evolve the biological nature of man in order to make the world a better place. The goal was to genetically engineer an improved version of the human being who will collectively lead humanity into a new era of peace. They were successful in doing so, creating a new breed of supermen known as augments, who were mentally and physically superior to ordinary men. When the augments emerged from their underground hiding, they found a world divided over the Cold War of the 70s. They were unhappy to find that their lives were under the control of government superpowers and were determined to do something about it.
Superior ability breeds superior ambition.
With their superior intellect, they rose to power by exploiting the existing global structures of government and corporations. The augments schemed from the shadows, bribing, blackmailing, and pressuring specific people to manipulate important events of the world. By controlling agents in government and corporations, they were able to control the majority of world affairs and shape a new world order while keeping their identities a secret. The most people ever saw was scattered brushfire wars and random acts of terrorism. The augments rose to power and held dominance over large portions of Earth in the beginning of the 1990s. The most notorious of these superhumans was Kang Nguyen Singh, who became the absolute ruler of more than a quarter of the planet, from Asia through to the Middle East. During his rule, there was no massacres or wars of aggression under him, fulfilling the vision of the world that the scientists wished for. Khan would later be referred to as the best of the tyrants in written history. While augments controlled most of the world, their arrogance didn't allow them to unify with each other, and so they started fighting amongst themselves. This was the start of the eugenics wars, which involved global world conflicts that lasted for 4 years. The augments were eventually overthrown by the people under them who were dissatisfied with the wars that their rulers were responsible for. Khan was the last of the tyrants to be defeated. He and 8 of his followers escaped the planet through his sleeper ship, the SS Botany Bay, returning the planet to human democratic rule. The amount of casualties from the eugenics wars was totaled to be in between 30 to 37 million people, with parts of Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa suffering the harshest from the aftermath. Many nations were severely politically destabilized after the wars. France was torn in a class war between the Trotskyists and the neo-Globalists. Parts of Asia were at an economic production standstill, affecting the global economy as a whole, and government slums were set up in United States cities, in which undesired citizens were forced to live in and were forgotten about. The people that made up Khan's old empire became the Eastern Coalition, or ECON, which included Asia, India, and parts of Europe and Africa. The Eastern Coalition was a major rival to the United States and the European Union, and their relations continually devolved from resource disputes, isolated terrorist attacks, and the increasingly military nature of the Eastern Coalition. On the 1st of May 2053, the Eastern Coalition launched a surprise attack against North American and European cities with nuclear weapons and bombing campaigns. In retaliation, the new United Nations launched their own nuclear strike against the Eastern Eastern Coalition. 500 million people were killed in this exchange, destroying many cities including London, Moscow, Berlin, Toronto, Jerusalem, Singapore, and Mexico City. People who were neutral in the war, such as the religious Muslim bloc in the Middle East, were also destroyed during the nuclear exchange. Drug-addled soldiers invaded each other's territories for years. The first major victory being the destruction of the Eastern Coalition governing palace that was invaded by American forces. The war ended in the same year out of necessity, when several remaining governments met in San Francisco in desperation to declare a ceasefire, effectively ending World War III. At the end of the war, most of the world's major governments collapsed. The total number of deaths was estimated to be over 600 million, with the majority being the deaths from the initial nuclear attacks. The end of the war was met with a dark age that swept across the planet, and was known as the post-atomic horror. Much of the Earth was radiated from nuclear explosions, making areas hazardous to enter. Enormous dust clouds enveloped the Earth, resulting in nuclear winters that further damaged already failing ecosystems. Drug-addled soldiers fought with warlords for whatever scraps of civilization was left, and vast sections of the world fell into barbarianism as chaos reigned for generations after. While things were bleak for the majority of the world, there were pockets of humanity who were still interested in furthering science, academia, and humanitarian causes. The most important figure of the time was Dr. Zefram Cochrane, a scientist whose work would forever change the world. He grew up with the love for science, internalizing himself in books at a young age while the world was still suffering from the aftermath of World War III. He specialized in antimatter-matter reactions, which are theorized to produce much more energy than a traditional chemical, fission, or fusion reactions. He was confident that he could build the world's first antimatter propulsion system that could reach speeds that was faster than light. Motivated from the profits he would earn from designing humanity's first warp drive, his personal project took a decade of his time and was done under great personal cost. The challenges mostly involved gouging up materials that his project needed and keeping his team well fed amidst a war-torn America. Cochrane ended up incorporating parts of nuclear missiles and other weapons of mass destruction to build his spaceship the Phoenix, proving that projects of peace can come from weapons of war. His project was a complete success. Using antimatter reactions, the Phoenix reached the speed of warp 1 for 1 minute in our solar system. History was made and celebrated under the great fanfare of all those involved in the Phoenix project. But that was just the beginning of history. Not only did Cochrane create the world's first warp drive, the antimatter energy signature that was outputted by the Phoenix was detected by a nearby alien race, the Vulcans, who immediately investigated the origins. For the first time in history, people knew that they were not alone in the universe. People put behind their differences, their prejudices, and their dark history to unite in a way that no one thought was possible. Through unity and under the mentorship of the Vulcans, humanity had worked together to solve the issues of poverty, war, and disease within 2 generations, creating a paradise on Earth. The Earth's and humanity's revival was made possible due to the value of Vulcan philosophy. The Vulcan philosophy was centered on preferencing logic above all else. Reason, principles, knowledge, and wisdom were the priorities of Vulcan life, suppressing or controlling their emotions to the point where they become beings of true logic. Vulcans applied logic in all areas of life, solving each problem that they faced through the application of deductive reasoning. The Vulcan race was not always the logical and peaceful beings that people know them to be. Before they embraced their philosophy, they allowed themselves to be irrationally controlled by their own emotions. Feelings such as paranoia and rage were common attributes for Vulcans in the early centuries. This enabled them to be an extremely violent and distrustful people who constantly waged wars against each other. As their level of technology improved, so did their destructive capabilities. The Vulcans eventually reached a point where their violent nature threatened the very existence of their species. Sensing that this could be the end of their race, a Vulcan philosopher named Zurak developed a new ideology that was based on reason. He argued that the cause of violence in the society laid in their own emotions, and that without controlling these emotions and replacing it with logic, their race would surely be doomed. This philosophy was accepted by the majority of the Vulcans, suppressing their emotions through meditation and replacing it with logic and reason to guide their lives. By controlling their emotions and living their lives purely from logical principles, they avoided certain disaster and flourished under a new Vulcan renaissance, which is referred to in their culture as the time of awakening. But not all Vulcans accepted this philosophy. A minority recognized the importance of using emotion over logic and rejected the teachings of Surak. This minority would eventually leave the home planet and disconnect from the Vulcan culture to become the Romulans, adversaries of the Vulcan race. The Vulcan philosophy of preferencing logic over emotion is not just isolated to Vulcan culture. Preferencing logic has also led to a time of awakening in our own world. After the fall of Rome, Western Europe entered the Middle Ages, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages by some historians to describe the economic, political, and cultural problems of the era. Superstition, religion, dogma, and emotions guided civilization throughout the early Middle Ages. Life was difficult with poverty, sickness, war, and religious ordeals being common practices throughout people's short lives. It was only when philosophers and scientists pushed the need for logic and reasoning did people come out of the Middle Ages to start the Age of Enlightenment in early modern history. The philosophical movement of the Enlightenment argued that civilization ought to be guided by empiricism and rational thought, not by faith or mysticism. They proved that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but that it revolved around the sun, which was counter to religious teachings and started the scientific revolution. They pushed for the separation of church and state, allowing for individual liberty and religious tolerance, and they argued against the divine right of kings that enabled monarchies, and instead argued for the consent of the governed, which enabled nationalistic democracies. By preferencing logic and reasoning in our own culture, it progressed the time period from the medieval era into the early modern era. This is where the Industrial Revolution took place to expand economies, and where individual liberty lessened the power of church and state over people's lives. Overall, the Age of Enlightenment increased life expectancy, happiness, and the well-being of people in the Western world in an unprecedented way. It was also responsible for future paradigm changes to take place, such as the end of slavery and the realization of the American dream. In the Star Trek universe, humanity would once again experience a similar dark age in the aftermath of World War III, just as it was after the fall of Rome. In the post-atomic horror, humanity suffered economic, political, and cultural strifes. This was also reflected in Vulcan history, where the culture similarly went through significant challenges just before their time of awakening. Following the teachings of Zurak, the Vulcans changed their culture and rebuilt their society. They transformed themselves from an emotionally violent, warmongering people to an advanced, spacefaring, peaceful society that made first contact with humanity. The Vulcans inspired humanity the way Zurak did, and reminded them of their potential, that humanity had the capability to be just as logical as the Vulcans. And through dedication to critical thinking and logic, they too can solve the many problems that Earth was facing. While the Vulcans took almost 1,000 years to rebuild their society after their cataclysmic nuclear wars, it took humanity only 2 generations, which both surprised and alarmed the Vulcans. Because of the help Vulcans provided to humanity, as well as the help humanity would later provide to them in return, the Vulcan-human relation matured into a deep friendship that would last for many decades, with some even describing the interspecies relationship as brotherly. The friendship between these 2 species would form the basis of the Federation, the largest and the most diverse galactic empire in the Alpha Quadrant. With the end of poverty and hunger through futurism, the economy of Earth transitioned into a self-described New World economy, where money became obsolete and fulfilling material needs was no longer desired. This theoretical economic model is referred to as a post-scarcity economy, where people had their basic needs met through automation and abundance. This is also referenced through the works of Karl Marx, who predicted a communist economic system that was based on free distribution, which would transition out of capitalism, and the Venus Project, which also predicted a similar world that was based on automation, which they used the moneyless world of Star Trek as a reference. The post-scarcity economy was achievable in Star Trek through two important gadgets: the transporter, which could beam any person or object to a target, removing the need for a transport industry, and replicators, which could recreate almost any object in seconds. The replicator device worked by converting energy into mass. Systematic blueprints of certain objects could be uploaded into the replica's database, and the device will be able to materialize that object by recreating it on a subatomic level. This is similar to how 3D printers work. 3D printers require systematic blueprints of certain objects, and then the device would materialize that object through several possible approaches. Through this process, items such as machine parts, trinkets, homes, and weapons can be produced at a fraction of the traditional price. The 3D printers on Star Trek were so advanced that they could replicate just about anything. They were used to create machine parts, clothing, weapons, medicine supplies, and foods, with the bigger industrial replicators used to build spaceships that Starfleet used. Although replicators transformed the agriculture, manufacturing, and medical industries, they still had considerable limitations that impacted their economic environments. Replicators couldn't replicate other replicators, which meant they had to be built and issued by the Federation. If the item you wanted wasn't on the replica's database, then you couldn't get what you wanted until a programmer submitted the design into it, which required time, talent, and knowledge. Specific contraband items such as drugs, alcohol, and weapons were banned in replicator use under Federation law and had to be smuggled in. Replicators would routinely break down and malfunction, which would make the replicators useless until an engineer repaired them. Replicators couldn't replicate important resources such as antimatter, dilithium, or lanthanum, which was used in space travel and trade. Some alien cultures resorted to slavery to mine those resources because of those replicator limitations, and replicators used a considerable amount of energy to produce items, which was a substantial problem on ships that had to conserve their energy supply. Those ships would have to use emergency food rations or grow food in their hydroponic bays when the energy was limited. Those technical problems aside, there was also a considerable amount of people who were against Federation technology and replicator use. Most people preferred the authenticity of real cuisines for their taste and their freshness. Replicated food and drinks were often rejected by customers, opting for real food whenever possible.
Quack, where's the carver juice?
You're still squeezing the roots, unless you want replicated.
We'll wait.
This created demand for traditional agriculture industries, including farming, vineyards, and restaurants, which was done by people who valued traditional food preparation and rejected the use of replicators. Even though replicators can be used to produce almost anything, there are still valuable resources that replicators could never manufacture. One of these resources was real estate. Valuable real estate was limited on Earth, with beachside properties, ocean views, and locations of property being more valuable than others. Captain Kirk is seen to live in a modern high-rise apartment in the San Francisco Bay Area. The low supply of apartments along the beach was met with a presumably high demand of people who wanted to live in them. Without property rights or money, these limited apartments would be contested by the many citizens of the Federation. These valuable real estate properties would have to be coordinated and controlled by the Federation according to rank, enabling favoritism and corruption from within the global government. Another major resource that replicators could not manufacture was specialized skills that relied on specific knowledge. While replicators could make medicine supplies, hyposprays, and vaccines, they couldn't make doctors, engineers, pilots, or security officers. The knowledge and skills that are found in these highly sought professions had to be taught in the academy, sometimes taking months or years at a time.
I'm a doctor, not an engineer.
No, you're an engineer.
In the later years of Star Trek, artificial intelligence and hologram technology was used to supplement the crew, but they lacked the cognition to understand the more nuanced features of diplomacy and human emotion, performing under par to their human counterpart in those areas. In post-scarcity economies, the value of manufacturing is considerably reduced, but the value of specialized knowledge would not be affected. This is the reality of Western societies that have embraced freer capitalistic monopolistic markets. With machine automation so high, manufacturing and factories are not as valuable as they used to be. This is compounded with 3D printing technologies and the globalization of the industrial world. The economy has transitioned where factory owners and farmers represent a minority of the working force, and that people who have specialized knowledge, including doctors, programmers, and entertainers, are the ones that earn the most. Even in a post-scarcity economy as depicted in Star Trek, removing money from society raises more questions than it answers. Money serves an actual purpose. It is used to store value. It is used to measure value. And it is used to trade value. That medium of exchange will still be needed in a replicator-enabled society for things that cannot be replicated, such as real estate, skills, and items that cannot be reproduced. Unless the Federation has forced the population to stop using money, money will still exist in some form where scarcity is still relevant. In Star Trek, this monetary value was represented as gold-pressed latinum, a rare chemical that could not be replicated and was in a fixed supply. Although the Federation didn't officially use this form of currency, many other alien cultures did, and so it is often used as the medium of exchange. When the Federation ran into cultures that they wanted to trade with, Starfleet either had to use gold-pressed platinum, offer specific tasks or favors for the trade, or take what they wanted through threats of force. Many citizens in the Federation did not have gold-pressed platinum because society didn't use them, and so they ran into problems when they wanted to trade with outside cultures. In an example, Jake Sisko wanted to buy a rare baseball card at an auction for his father, but couldn't bid because he didn't have anything of value to bid with. He had to confront the winner after the auction and ask for the card, which the winner sent him on several errand tasks to enable that trade. If Jake and other citizens had money, they would be able to compete in auctions and deal with situations that involved trades. Money is often seen as an evil tool in communist and socialist circles because they say it enables class divide through greed and exploitation. While greed can be attributed to negative behaviors, it can also be attributed to positive behaviors. The desire of wanting through greed can push people into action and initiate projects that fall outside of their comfort zone. Zephyrin Cochrane was motivated to work on the first warp drive because of the greed and riches it would bring to him. Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek so he could earn riches to pay off his mortgage, a motivation that was due to greed. In gambling games such as Tabo or Tongo, greed was used to add excitement in gaining or losing something of value. Without greed or wanting money, the motivation to do tasks would be limiting. It is speculated that under a post-scarcity economy as depicted in the Federation, people would still be motivated to work without the incentive that money brings. Without money, the motivation for doing undesirable tasks would be done for their own social status or to better mankind through compassion. They would choose to spend hours preparing food at a restaurant instead of using those same hours in the holodeck for fun and entertainment.
You know, if we stay with Grandpa, he's gonna put me to work in the kitchen.
Is that so bad?
Well, chopping vegetables for 9 hours a day isn't exactly my idea of a vacation.
In Federation starships, crew members were ordered to carry out mundane and tedious tasks out of duty to Starfleet. Sometimes these crew members were punished to perform additional tasks as a form of disciplinary action. Other members would sometimes trade tasks that no one wanted to do, or offered to do them as favors to gain influence from their superiors. The holodecks, in comparison, were in a constant high demand and had to be shared across the crew. The timings were scheduled and reserved in advance because of the limited space they could accommodate, and sometimes had to be rationed out. In moneyless economies where there is an abundance, there will be little incentive for preferencing tasks that are boring and tedious, over doing tasks that are fun and entertaining. Economically, without money in society, there will be difficulties in trading arrangements, difficulties in assigning value to things, and there will be no monetary incentives for people to do tasks. It's hard to accept that a moneyless society will ever be possible in a future post-scarcity economy such as the one Star Trek depicts, nor will it ever be possible in various ideologues that promote moneyless societies. After the United Earth recovered from the aftermath of the post-atomic horror, they were able to mass-produce spaceships with antimatter warp drives and expand out into the solar system. Once the United Earth colonized and outgrew their own planet confines, they became the United Federation of Planets. with Vulcans being one of the 4 founding members. The United Federation of Planets was an interstellar federal republic composed of many planetary governments that agreed to exist under a single central government. The Federation was based on the principles of universal liberty, rights, equality, and shared their knowledge and resources in peaceful cooperation. They became one of the most powerful interstellar states in known space, with total number of formal member worlds reaching over 150. The executive branch of the Federation commanded foreign policy and served as the supreme commander of the Federation's military forces. The legislature of the Federation Council created, amended, and ratified Federation law. Some of these laws include regulating spaceflight and licensing laws in Federation space, as well as implementing drug and alcohol policies, banning particular drugs on their ships and in space. They also had a monopoly on deep space flight exploration. Many citizens grew up dreaming about being captains of spaceships, but only Starfleet was permitted to build these powerful ships and controlled who could pilot them. Citizens of the Federation who wanted to explore deep space had to go through the official channels of the Federation to earn that right, either through Starfleet Academy to become an enlisted crew member and work up the ranks, or by getting a master's license, which is a legal document civilians needed to have to operate space vessels. The traditional cultures of Earth embraced national segregation based on race, ethnicity, and governmental divides, until first contact with the Vulcans. Once humanity discovered that they were not alone in the galaxy, they gained a new perspective over their identity and united under one global government that embraced all of humanity. The Federation encouraged diversity and inclusivity between races, cultures, genders, and sexuality within their ranks, and did not discriminate against any of these attributes. However, once individuals enrolled into Starfleet Academy, each person, regardless of the strengths or limitations of their race or species, were tested of their capabilities against a universal standard. The exams that screened each applicant who wished to join Starfleet tested for certain qualities that each candidate needed to display, including integrity, intelligence, courage, imagination, and leadership. Only the best of these candidates were accepted into the Academy to later become Starfleet officers, while the others that failed were disbarred from joining, screening for excellence to encourage meritocracy within Starfleet ranks. Humans were best suited for the Academy, as they were well-rounded enough to meet all of the criteria needed for graduation. Vulcans outperformed humans when it came to fields relating to integrity and intelligence, but struggled with tests relating to imagination and leadership as they lacked emotion. Klingons that were accepted in the Federation excelled in martial excellence and fitness because of their physical capabilities, but could not match the humans or the Vulcans in intelligence or the Conundrum IQ test. And Nog, a Ferengi, could use his heightened sense of hearing to gain an advantage in field combat, bringing a racial quality into Starfleet that no other species could match. Ultimately, those who graduated from the Academy and served in Starfleet were placed in the most appropriate role that they could fulfill, which was typically based on their strengths and capabilities, whether it would be operations, security, or engineering. The captain was a head of command within each starship, and while each captain sought counsel from high-ranking members of the ship to help make their decisions, every order made by the captain carried over the authority of Starfleet. Each personnel that served under the captain was compelled to carry out the captain's orders. So while Starfleet was diverse and inclusive, only the best and the most talented were allowed to serve on starships, had to follow the orders given by the captain, all the while observing the governing framework of Starfleet. Governing policies from the central authority in Earth over to star systems that were light years away were typically met with apprehensiveness, particularly when it came to colonies along the edges of the Federation. Earth is correctly considered a paradise, with no wars, crime, or poverty, but it is often dangerous living along the frontiers of the Federation and next to other hostile alien cultures. Because of the utopian nature of Earth, it's difficult for the Federation Council to understand understand or even empathize what life is like for people in those neutral zones. Federation officials often underestimate or are unsympathetic to Federation citizens when the timings are not convenient for them. Many citizens are dismissive of Federation policies and even Federation capabilities, rejecting them as self-interested bureaucrats who don't actually serve in the interest of their citizens.
Why didn't you notify Starfleet?
Wait 6 months while the bureaucrats sit around reading reports trying to figure out what to do? They don't know what's going on out here.
One of the most important Federation principles that was enforced in Starfleet was the Prime Directive. It states that no one should interfere with pre-warp civilizations, even if such interference was well-intentioned. The reasons for such was to reaffirm that Starfleet were peaceful explorers, not gods that interfered with other societies. Primitive civilizations that were exposed to advanced technology usually led to disastrous events. The penalty of violating the Prime Directive resulted in punishments ranging from formal reprimands to imprisonment to penal colony sentences after a court-martial. While Starfleet generally complied and respected the Prime Directive, not all Starfleet personnel believed that strict adherence to the Prime Directive was in the best interests of the civilizations they explored. Different Starfleet captains had different tolerances for the degree of flexibility when it came to the Prime Directive. Captain Kirk felt that the Prime Directive didn't apply to civilizations that were stagnated or had been enslaved, while Captain Picard and Janeway were prepared to watch whole societies die from natural causes rather than interfere to preserve the Prime Directive. Different cultures outside of the Federation had different standards regarding the Prime Directive. Before the Vulcans joined the Federation, they would provide advanced knowledge to societies on a case-by-case scenario. They typically got involved when they felt the society was ready. This was especially relevant in humanity's first contact event. The Vulcans determined that humanity was worthy enough to share technology with because of Zephyrin Cochrane's successful warp drive. They thought that the accomplishments of a small group of people reflected the potential of the human species as a whole. While the Vulcans thought that humans were worthy, the Federation would not have come to that same conclusion if the positions were reversed. In accordance to the Prime Directive, Earth would have been seen as a primitive civilization, considering that the vast majority of people were engaged in tribalism from the post-atomic horrors of World War III. Warp drive technology was typically the criteria set by the Federation to test if alien cultures were advanced enough for first contact. But if the species had little to no knowledge of other worlds and spacefaring civilizations around them, then the Prime Directive protocols would disallow first contact. If the Vulcans had chose not to interfere with Earth when it did, then Earth surely would have declined further before it had a chance of revival, if it even had a chance of revival at all. It's hypocritical that the Federation, who owes everything it has to the interference of an advanced civilization, made it their Prime Directive to not interfere with civilizations that were beneath them, even if they desperately needed their help. This double standard of ethical principles is a recurring theme within Federation policy. Because Starfleet was run as a naval organization, Starfleet personnel were obligated to follow the orders of their superiors, no matter how much it impeded on personal feelings or ethical considerations. This led to many ethical conflicts and debates among the crew relating to Starfleet policies, the validity of Federation regulations, and even the legitimacy of the Federation itself in extreme cases. The Federation, which controlled a vast amount of territory, were also vulnerable to the limitations of humanity, such as hysteria and paranoia. One of the most formidable enemies were the Founders, a shape-shifting alien race that could morph into anything they wished, emulating the politicians of the Federation and exploiting their hierarchical methods of command. In fear, the Federation implemented a policy that required all citizens to take periodic blood tests to make sure they were human and not imposters. This was met with rage by the citizens, refusing to abide this Federation policy that they felt was against their freedoms and rights. The people who refused were treated with suspicion and were sometimes coerced to give blood. This type of abuse and hysteria among the Federation was exactly what the Founders aimed to do. By exploiting the power structure of this government, they were able to use fear and paranoia to divide the Federation apart, which further exposed the flaws of the Federation. While the Federation preaches the values of peace, liberty, and freedoms, they were prepared to sacrifice those values if it meant preserving the Federation. Under Article 14, Section 31 of the United Earth Starfleet Charter, certain rules of conduct can be bent during times of extraordinary crisis. This charter was all the justification the Federation needed to enable a rogue agency within Starfleet. Section 31 is an officially non-existent and non-condoned rogue government department that operated in the shadows of the Federation. They got their hands dirty with any tasks that the Federation doctrine couldn't touch, providing wet work services to the enemies of Starfleet. These services include brainwashing, assassinations, kidnapping, torture, virus engineering, manufacturing false flag events, enslavement, and even genocide, a crime that is most opposed by the Federation. The existence of Section 31 made Starfleet and the Federation lose a considerable amount of moral credibility, but were seen as ultimately necessary in preserving the Federation. This makes their principles of liberty and universal rights secondary to upholding the Federation empire by any means necessary. With Starfleet officials interpreting the Prime Directive based on their own subjective context, the vast scope of space that was impossible to govern, the high demand of people who wanted to explore deep space on their own, the hierarchical structure of the Federation that could be easily manipulated, and the fact that citizens were not free to ignore the Federation begs an important question. Was the Federation a positive force on humanity, or was it something that held humanity back? Couldn't the citizens of the Federation self-govern themselves in a more moral and efficient way without the need of a central galactic authority? A significant proportion of Federation citizens believed that they could, and began to revolt against the Federation as they became increasingly angry over Federation policies. They were the Maquis, ex-citizens of the Federation, who gave up on their allegiances after they were dissatisfied with Federation law. The catalyst of this separation was the Federation-Cardassian Treaty, a peace agreement that ended the territorial war between the Federation and the Cardassian Union. As part of the treaty, many colony homes in contested space were to be handed over to the Cardassian Union. This angered the colonists, who felt the Federation had no right to force them out of their colonies and refused to leave in opposition, which eventually devolved into a war between the Cardassians and the colonists. The Federation refused to help the colonists, labeling them as separatists, even though it was the Cardassians who initially broke the treaty by attacking the colonists first. The colonists then declared their separation from the Federation and defended their colonies against Cardassian aggression on their own, forming new relations with other alien cultures outside of Starfleet protocol, and used the black market in Federation space to smuggle in weaponry. In the eyes of the Maquis, the Federation had abandoned them, choosing to align themselves with the Cardassian Union over their own people. The Federation had shown that they were willing to let their citizens die to protect their own interests, and outside bystanders started to question the values of the Federation and their own loyalty to Starfleet. The Federation attempted to undo the growing Maquis support by organizing missions that attacked specific targets that were of importance to the colonists. Many Starfleet officers were ethically opposed to harming ex-Federation citizens, as they were sympathetic to the Maquis movement and considered their cause just. In response, the Federation would double down on these conflicted Starfleet officers, threatening them with court-martials and penal colony sentences if they disobeyed their orders, which only led to more Starfleet officers defecting from the Federation, which further legitimized the Maquis. One of the Maquis' leading members was Michael Eddington, a Starfleet security officer who joined the Maquis after being disillusioned with Starfleet and the Federation policies. He compared the Federation with the Borg, saying they both offered people paradise if they joined the collective, but did not permit people to leave once they did. However, unlike the Borg, the Federation is not open about their plans of assimilation. The Federation assimilates people without the individual even knowing it, making the Federation far more dishonest and insidious than the Borg. The Federation justifies its existence and earns the respect of its citizens by upholding the moral values that humanity stands for. But whenever the Federation dismisses those moral principles to further their own self-interests, it creates an enormous divide between the citizens that are principled and the citizens that are not. When a central authority violates principles that are valued by its citizens, it can create a split so significant that the only way to amend it is either through political revolution or civil war. Other alien cultures do not have this problem. Not only do some of these aliens tolerate the unethical practices of what their leaders do, but they openly encourage it, as their empires justify themselves. The Romulans, the Cardassians, and the Klingons do not make any declarations about their empire's moral values, and instead promote their state as supreme, encouraging conquests, occupations, and wars against lesser species. The Klingons were a feared and respected warrior race that believed in the virtue of violence and the honor of victory. The Cardassians were taught to obey their parents as family was all, which transitioned into being completely serving and loyal to their people in Cardassian nationalism. The Romulans were a proud militaristic civilization where state rank influenced their social standing. In these three empires, the state was central to their civilization, and so what was good for the empire was good for everyone. Each of these empires had expansionist policies, finding valor in overthrowing weaker worlds, and pushed out their borders into oppressed against an alien empire they could not control. The state made no declarations of principles or virtues, as the state itself was virtue. This adorning of the state made each of the three empires fiercely aggressive and militant in nature, creating constant wars, devolving into regular disputes, while spreading despair across the galaxy. These imperial empires derived power by subjugating lesser species. Smaller civilizations would join the Federation out of necessity and fear out of other warring empires. Under the Federation's values of peace, freedoms, and individual rights, other member races joined willingly and were considered equals in the Federation's democratic society. Through this process, the Federation grew to become the largest empire of the Alpha Quadrant without firing a shot. The larger empires were too ethnocentric to join the Federation, as they would have to give up too much racial identity, history, and patriotism to be part of a diverse community. They would only allow themselves to have a temporary alliance with the Federation if it suited their goals, or if they were under threat of a greater power. The high self-esteem developed from their racial identity and ethnic traditions meant a cultural revolution would require an enormous paradigm shift, in which all avenues of civil life would have to be questioned. Most would rather fight and die in glory for their empire and race, rather than sacrifice their values. The constant wars resulted in great losses across the Cardassian, Romulan, and Klingon empires, which ultimately stagnated their civilizations, and grew the power of Starfleet as more alien societies joined the Federation. Aliens within these ethnocentric empires who breeded outside of their own race to produce hybrid cross-species were typically considered outcasts in their societies. These hybrids would often join the Federation to be part of a greater community. Despite the aggressive nature of these empires, there were sizable groups within them who were inspired by the values of the Federation and were worried of the constant wars that their empires enabled. These people encouraged positive change within their governments and society, but were met with personal attacks, ridiculement, and threats to their lives, which reflected the level of moral integrity and corruption within their own societies. Outside of empires and the Federation, there was another civilization that embraced a completely different philosophy and had a peaceful history compared to the other races. They were the Ferengi, an old and diplomatic alien race that were not interested in conquest, war, or supremacy, but made the virtue of greed the center of their philosophy. The Ferengi lived for the thrill of earning profit, acquiring trade deals, and building businesses. Entrepreneurs were the pillars of their society and were idolized over warriors and politicians. Their focus on profits meant the Ferengi looked down on the obsession of justice, honor, logic, compassion, or warrior pride, seeing them as foolish notions. Instead, it was greed that was the exalted trait, and was seen as the noble virtue. While laws or military doctrines typically shaped cultures, it was the rules of acquisition that shaped the Ferengis. A series of guidelines that provided the foundation of business philosophy, which encouraged greed and promoted capitalism. They became the leading cultures in interstellar commerce, buying the technology of the warp drive instead of engineering or stealing it themselves. Because they were motivated by profits, they invented new technologies that were sold across the galaxy, including holosuites, Syntheno, and the popular drink Slugger Cola. In Ferengi culture, the Great Material Continuum was their spiritual belief, a metaphor that describes the binding force of all life in the universe.
You see, there are millions upon millions of worlds in the universe, each one filled with too much of one thing and not enough of another. And the Great Continuum flows through them all like a mighty river, from have to want and back again. And if we navigate the continuum with skill and grace, our ship will be filled with everything our hearts desire.
This is no time for Ferengi fairy tales.
The continuum is real.
Because their history is based on capitalism and not nation states, there were no great wars in their alliance, no history of slavery, and no atrocities such as genocide, making their history uniquely non-violent compared to their neighbors. This accomplishment made the Ferengis feel morally superior over any other galactic power, including the Benevolent Federation.
Humans used to be a lot worse than the Ferengi. Slavery, concentration camps, interstellar wars. We have nothing in our past that approaches that kind of barbarism. We're nothing like you. We're better.
Whenever the Ferengi Alliance came into conflict with another power, they used the power of coin and trade to deal with their disputes, and avoided battles or wars. The Ferengi generally stayed neutral in the politics of the galaxy, since making enemies diminished business opportunities. Even as a neutral power, the economic might of the Ferengi Alliance gave them a significant influence over the galaxy. The business practices of the Ferengi was often despised by other alien cultures. Their weak physical capabilities made them easy targets against stronger aggressive species. The Klingon Empire in particular is known to hate the Ferengi in almost all circumstances, despite no history of bad relations between the two governments. The Ferengi depended on strong, stable governments or paid mercenaries to protect them against marauders who would plunder them for their resources, as they were high-valued targets and couldn't defend themselves against stronger empires.
And when governments fall, people like me are lined up and shot.
There is that risk. But then you are a gambler, Quark.
The Ferengi are often referenced as extreme capitalists, believers of free enterprise and embracers of laissez-faire markets. But this isn't the case within their culture. There are a series of regulatory agencies, legal frameworks, and governmental bodies which controlled and regulated trade. The Ferengi Commerce Authority implemented bylaws, the regulatory framework that imposes strict rules on trade, ensuring that all businesses conducted by Ferengis adhered to their traditional cultural values. While they controlled businesses, they were mainly created as another opportunity for profit, promoting bribery and corruption within these agencies. These agencies granted power to agents known as liquidators to enforce their laws, and were the most feared people within their society. They had the capacity to issue heavy fines, revoke business licenses, and issued attainers that prevented any Ferengi from doing business. This is seen as worse than a prison sentence or a death sentence, as they were ostracized from the greed-driven society and were unable to fulfill the need for profits. The Ferengi Commerce Authority also banned Ferengi women from trading and owning businesses. Ferengi society were highly misogynistic towards their own women. Laws were institutionalized to uphold that perspective, barring Ferengi women from having the same rights as men. They were forbidden to acquire profit, were not allowed to wear clothes or travel, and were discouraged in having opinions or political views. This irrational fear and hatred of Ferengi women ended up being used against the male. females, as other women of the galaxy were able to manipulate them by stimulating the erogenous zones on their earlobes. Through this type of handling, women could take advantage of the weakness of Ferengi psychology and could persuade Ferengis into accepting one-sided deals that they would typically not agree on if they were comfortable and accepting of women. This institutionalized misogyny started to phase out when the Ferengi began to realize that excluding females from businesses represented a significant loss in their profits. If these women were included in business, then they could expand the Ferengi workforce and their consumer base, as they represented more than 50% of the population. This argument from greed was the only justification the Ferengi needed to undo the generations of patriarchy and included women into their markets, beginning the possibility of equality between the sexes. By the end of Deep Space Nine, the Ferengi Alliance was undertaking radical social reforms and was changing into a new Ferenginar. These reforms included a new progressive tax system, subsidizing the poor, retirement benefits for the elderly, and universal health care. These policies will presumably be managed by the various Ferengi government agencies who regulated trade, who are very open about accepting bribery and enabling corruption within their own ranks. With greed still considered a virtue among Ferengi culture, we'll most likely see a decline of social standards as capitalism is reduced and corrupt government officials take further control over the economy, allowing for crony capitalism and government-enforced monopolies over a freer market. These new regulations was not the standard in established Ferengi culture and was strongly opposed by the Ferengi who value traditional greed over central reforms, fearing that this will begin a cultural and spiritual decline in Ferenginar.
The line has to be drawn here, this far and no further!
With the Alpha Quadrant sharing its territory with the Federation, the Klingons, the Romulans, the Cardassians, and the Ferengi, over the Gulf of Space lies one totalitarian empire that held control over the entire Gamma Quadrant. The Dominion. The Dominion is an advanced interstellar empire that has conquered countless worlds for over 2,000 years before starting a war with the Federation for invading its territory. It is a fascist hierarchical organization, with the changelings known as the Founders at the top, the genetically enhanced Vortas serving as intermediaries in the middle, and the genetically created Jem'Hadar serving as shock troops at the bottom. On behalf of the Founders, these two species expanded Dominion territory through diplomacy and military conquest. The Vortans and the Jem'Hadar considered their creators to be their gods, and served them unquestionably. The motivation for the Founders' continued conquests are based on their past relations with outside species. They refer to everyone outside of their race as solids, as they couldn't morph and change their shape like the Founders could. The Founders were once peaceful explorers who wanted to learn about their galaxy, but they would constantly be persecuted and attacked by the solids who felt intimidated by their morphing capabilities. They found it much easier and safer to dominate the solids through their superior cloning technology and advanced weaponry. This exceptionalism is further justified through the Great Link, an existence that the changelings shared. That was a form of pure existence, where thoughts, feelings, and sensations are constantly expressed and shared between the Founders. They considered this natural state as their utopia, that the solids could never experience or relate to, which further justified their superiority. The Founders rationalized their actions by claiming they imposed order on an anarchic society, and that the solids will always pose a threat to them unless they are permanently under their control. The Founders were also immortal and perceived time differently while in the Great Link. They did not age or grow old like the solids did, which gave them a strong military advantage in war, as time was always on their side. The Founders planned their military campaigns with this in mind, as they could always outlast the solids in wars of attrition. Most of their wars were planned and fought across multiple generations and over hundreds of years, something that most solids couldn't even grasp, let alone prepare for. The Dominion ruled with with coercion and domination, which is contrasted against the Federation's values of cooperation and freedoms. The gentle-looking and calm-spoken Votar would offer diplomacy and negotiation on behalf of the Founders. If this diplomacy failed, then the Founders would unleash the brute force of the Jem'Hadar. This carrot-and-stick approach is a common way of enforcing policies, offering rewards and punishments to encourage certain behaviors. The Changelings' unique capability is that they were able to shapeshift and morph into any object or person. Through this, they were able to exploit the hierarchical structures of enemy empires, gather intelligence from behind enemy lines, influence policy change by imitating important people, and even encourage opportunistic wars under the disguise of someone else. Through this approach, not only could they emulate those in power, but they could also spread fear and paranoia to a population, as they could never be sure who to trust. The Votar and the Jem'Hadar were both genetically engineered to worship the Founders and believed that their lives belonged to the Changelings rather than themselves. This arrangement was referred to as the Order of Things, which was programmed into their biology. Any deviation from it was punishable by death. The Jem'Hadar was especially bred to be violent and arrogant. To limit the chance of rebellion within the Jem'Hadar, they were designed to live for a few short years. They were also dependent on a drug developed by the Founders and issued by the Votar, which was named Ketracine White. They required frequent doses of this drug to survive, with withdrawals leading to intense pain and their eventual deaths. By controlling this drug, the Votar could control their lives, and so the possibility of rebellion against the Founders was restrained. While utmost devotion was bred into these two species, sometimes their programmed virtues would conflict with other values, leading to internal emotional struggles which ultimately questioned the order of things. The Founders would dismiss these breeds as defected and executed them if they threatened their interests. An example was one of the Weyoun clones who objected to the Founders' war. He felt that the war was wrong, that their obsession with conquering the Alpha Quadrant was misguided, and that living in peace with the Solids would be in the best interests of everyone involved. Although that was a valid position to take, he was labeled as defective for questioning the orders of the Founders and was ultimately killed. Another example is the Jem'Hadar First, who was inspired by Wolf's warrior code. To the Jem'Hadar, victory was life, and so he was conflicted when he was ordered to kill Wolf, one of the most honorable and victorious warriors that the First had ever fought against. He refused the order of the Votar to kill Wolf, which got him executed for defying that order. Because the Founders were considered supreme, any subordinates that disobeyed them, whether it was from the two species that were bred to serve them, or the people from the worlds that they conquered, could not be tolerated. Even if the Dominion won the war against the Federation, holding their dominance over the Federation would take a massive occupational army, an enormous amount of ships, and constant vigilance to suppress resistance, which is a task that would be challenging even for the Dominion. The Dominion War was lost due to the Founders applying too much stick and not enough carrot. The evil and ruthless nature of the Dominion made enemies of practically every empire of the Alpha Quadrant, unifying them over their common hatred over the Dominion. Even with the production capabilities of the Founders and the breeding numbers of the Jem'Hadar, the Founders couldn't maintain the war at all fronts, and lost after their own allies rebelled against them, with great costs to the Alpha Quadrant. Over the Dominion-controlled space of the Gamma Quadrant lies the Delta Quadrant, home of the most feared Borg, which was the galaxy's greatest threat. The Borg was seen as a series of pseudo-species cyborgs that were linked together to form a great hive mind. The essence of the Borg were the nanoprobes that were injected into bloodstreams. These nanoprobes infected cells and assimilated people into their collective. Once assimilated, the nanoprobes could communicate through subspace with other Borg drones and share each other's thoughts, creating an overarching hive mind. This hive mind acted as one consciousness, carrying its will through the consensus of the Borg drones. The Borg viewed assimilation as desirable for both themselves and the victim species. Through assimilation, everything that makes you unique is shared across the Borg, and you will receive the distinctiveness of other species that have been assimilated before you. In the process, you will lose your personal freedoms, your self-identity, and your individual rights, but gain the benefits of everything the Borg offers you, including immortality. To the Borg, individuality and personal freedoms are seen as primitive concepts that enable authority-driven societies, such as the Federation, democracy, and other republics. The Borg Collective believed that these hierarchical societies were obsolete and weak compared to the collective existence that the Borg offers. This complete rejection of individualism over collectivism in Borg society is often promoted in collectivist ideologies, such as communism, socialism, and statism. These ideologies also advocate that the individual is weak and that they can be exploited through other individuals or stronger collectives, which is why they must give up some of their individuality for the collective. The unique technological capability of the Borg allowed each drone to share and communicate with everyone in the collective at once, something that cannot be done in other collectives where free will exists in individuals. In the Borg, there are no classes, no individualism, no hierarchies, and no property rights. All property in the Borg is shared with each other as one conscious entity. Each individual drone is identical and equal to each other, fulfilling the definition of an egalitarian society. And each policy the hive mind creates is done through the democratic process of the drones in the collective. Even their ships are equal and lack hierarchies, with no bridge, no command centers, and no engineering sections. The motivation of the Borg lies within their philosophy, to seek perfection. Because the Borg are not capable of innovating technology on their own, they relied on assimilating or stealing other technology for the Borg to improve itself. Races that were seen as distinct or advanced were targeted for assimilation, while species that were seen as inferior or primitive were ignored. The Borg are the most feared species of the galaxy because they assimilated people against their will, robbing them of their personas and individuality without their consent. They do not respect other people's preferences and crush that preference through force. To the Borg, forcing the individual to join their collective is required in achieving perfection, because similar collective societies believe that the individual holds little value over their collective. They must coerce people to give up their moral beliefs, their individuality, and their property to achieve the collective's goals. Individuals have little choice but to submit themselves to the collective or be punished by them, under the basis of social justice, the greater good, or equality. Despite the strengths of the Borg, their technological distinctiveness had inherent flaws within their system, which could be exploited by their enemies. Artificial intelligence such as Data could access their neural link through subspace and issue commands such as sleep, which affected their whole collective. Nanoprobes were also a weak link in the Borg physiology, as pathogens could be developed by medical teams to serve as viral weapons against the Borg. Other superior biological life forms, such as species A472, had stronger cells that could not be infected by Borg nanoprobes, and was immune to Borg assimilation. Their biotechnology was so advanced compared to contemporary Borg technology that the Borg faced extinction when species 8472 retaliated against their invasion. And other Borg drones that had been severed from the Borg collective to regain their independence were involved in constant civil wars against the Borg to free other drones from the collective. I would argue that the Borg are not an advanced race seeking perfection, but rather an ignorant race seeking vanity. They have suffered devastating losses through Federation conflicts. They are involved in constant civil wars between other drones that have left the collective, and they face the combined hatred of all of the empires who oppose them. All of this could be avoided by respecting people's preferences and only assimilated people who wish to be assimilated. Unlike most other collectives, the Borg offers many things of value through assimilation, the most significant being immortality. There would be plenty of volunteers who would welcome all of the Borg's benefits if given the chance. If Borg assimilation was voluntary, no empire would have an issue with them. They would be the most virtuous species throughout the galaxy, as they would enable choice. The people who become drones would become drones because they wanted to, not because they were forced to. These new drones would add to the distinctiveness of the collective and help the Borg out of their own self-interest, not out of coercion. This is the only way that the Borg could ever achieve true perfection. Although Although the Borg Collective could easily transition into a voluntary society by making assimilation voluntary and still maintain its structure and its culture, other empires, such as the Federation, could not. The technological physiology of the Borg made it so direct democracy could be expressed flawlessly within the collective at all times, while the limitations of the humanoid species who thought independently of each other could only express their will through periodic elections once every few years. The thousands of species that were assimilated into their collective lost their distinctiveness when they became drones. Once species were assimilated into their collective, their genes, their appearance, and their ethnicity were all destroyed in the process, all for the impossible and completely arbitrary goal of perfection. The Federation, whilst only having under 200 member worlds, still respected and maintained the racial distinctiveness of each species that joined the Federation. The Federation did not forcefully assimilate the diverse racial species together like the Borg did. They recognized the strengths and weaknesses that each species possessed, and embraced those unique traits as they were to best serve the Federation. Starfleet demanded excellence and promoted competition within the Academy. They only allowed the most exceptional individuals to represent the United Federation of Planets in exploration and discovery. No species were granted special privileges over others, regardless of the advantages or limitations of their race. They were expected to submit to Starfleet protocol, follow the orders of their superiors, and earn promotions through experience and merit. Each species focused on their inherent strengths to become the dominant powers of the galaxy. The Vulcans' philosophy of logic made them one of the most respected and technologically advanced members of the galaxy. The Klingons' capability of violence made them warriors who valued honor and victory, becoming a feared and respected empire. The passion and the cunningness of the Romulans posed a constant danger to the Federation and the Klingons, as they are able to manipulate the flaws of other species and plot them against each other. The love of greed made the Ferengi the most powerful economic force in the galaxy, and was central in most diplomatic affairs. The capabilities of the Dominion enabled them a 2,000-year reign over the Gamma Quadrant, and the technological capabilities of the Borg allowed them to assimilate all races into their collective, granting their drones immortality and unity across thousands of species. But the capability and potential of humanity dwarfed all others in comparison, as we are robust enough to take on every trait that other species excelled at, while taking none of their weaknesses. We are capable of using logic without sacrificing emotion, balancing both forces to make the most informed decision, unlike the Vulcans who only used logic. We could match the Klingons in violence and combat, having the courage to stand up against them and earned their friendship through victory and honor. We outmatched the cunningness of the Romulans, manipulating them to join us in the war against the Dominion, which they were previously aligned with. We see the value of greed and trade as the Ferengi do, which made them powerful trading partners and friends within the Federation. We were more ruthless than the Dominion, being the only species in the Alpha and Gamma Quadrant that were capable of genociding the Founders, which made them surrender and retreat from Federation space. And the Borg were never successful in assimilating humanity in the constant invasion attempts, as we were able to use their own technology against them. The potential and well-roundedness of humanity encompasses all of the strengths that other alien cultures have, while demonstrating none of their weaknesses. We were loved, hated, feared, and respected. The values demonstrated through the crew of Starfleet and the benevolent qualities shown in the Federation has inspired millions of viewers throughout the generations to also reach for their highest potential. Space is the final frontier, a place where no one has gone before, and a place where many of us aspire to be. But it's up to the best of us to earn that right before we can reach for the stars.